When the Bell P-39 Airacobra first appeared in Europe, German pilots laughed at it. Compared to sleek Bf-109s and Fw-190s, the Airacobra looked bulky, slow, and outdated. Its high-altitude performance was poor, its supercharger was weak, and many Luftwaffe aces dismissed it immediately as a second-rate American experiment. They believed it would be chewed apart over the front lines. What they didn't realize was that the P-39 was about to become one of the deadliest low-altitude fighters of the entire war. Part of the skepticism came from the Airacobra's unusual layout. Its engine was mounted behind the pilot, connected to the propeller through a long drive shaft running under the cockpit floor. The plane had tricycle landing gear, a car-style side-opening door, and a 37mm cannon firing through the propeller hub. To pilots used to traditional fighter designs, the P-39 looked like something built by a mad inventor. But this odd design would give it several unexpected advantages, especially close to the ground. The biggest problem with the P-39 was altitude. Without a turbo supercharger, the plane struggled above 12,000 feet. In Western Europe, where air combat often took place high above the clouds, this was a crippling flaw. That's why American and British pilots quickly relegated it to secondary roles. They simply couldn't fight German fighters diving from superior altitude. And to the Luftwaffe, the Airacobra became a joke, an aircraft that was never meant to be a high-altitude dogfighter trying to compete where it didn't belong. On the Eastern Front, everything changed. The Soviet Air Force fought a completely different kind of air war. Dogfights weren't happening at 25,000 feet. They were happening at treetop level, right above tanks, trenches, and rivers. What Western pilots saw as the P-39's weakness, Soviet pilots saw as a perfect match for their battlefield environment. They didn't need altitude performance. They needed firepower, ruggedness, and a fighter that handled beautifully close to the ground. And the Airacobra fit that role better than almost anything else. When Soviet test pilots first evaluated the P-39, they were surprised. At low altitude, the engine delivered strong acceleration. The center of gravity, shifted by the mid-engine layout, gave the aircraft superb roll rate and stability. The tricycle landing gear made rough field takeoffs easier, and the powerful 37mm cannon, initially mocked by Western pilots, was deadly against ground targets and heavily armored aircraft. The Soviets realized the Airacobra wasn't a failed interceptor. It was a knife designed for knife-range combat. Before long, German pilots who had laughed at the P-39 began encountering it in the skies over the Eastern Front. But something was different. These weren't inexperienced American or British rookies trying to fight at altitude. These were Soviet aces using the P-39 exactly where it excelled: low, fast, and aggressive. At these altitudes, the Luftwaffe's high-altitude advantages vanished. German pilots soon found themselves being outturned, out-accelerated, and outgunned in the very terrain the Airacobra dominated. One burst from the P-39's 37mm cannon could shred a Messerschmitt or Focke-Wulf in a single hit. German ace Erich Hartmann once admitted the cannon was so powerful that if a P-39 landed a solid shot, the aircraft simply fell apart. While the cannon fired slowly and had limited ammo, Soviet pilots adapted their tactics to deliver deadly short-range volleys. German pilots, who originally ridiculed the huge gun, now feared being anywhere within its effective range. One advantage few predicted was how well the P-39 performed in vertical maneuvers. Its mid-engine balance allowed tight loops, quick dives, and sudden climbs without losing stability. Soviet pilots exploited this ruthlessly. Luftwaffe fighters, designed for high-altitude operations, weren't optimized for this kind of low-level aerobatics. A German pilot diving down to attack Soviet troops might suddenly find a P-39 on his tail, then realize too late that the Airacobra could stay glued to him through every twist of the engagement. No story about the Airacobra is complete without Aleksandr Pokryshkin, the second highest scoring Allied ace of the war. Flying the P-39, he pioneered a new style of low-altitude combat using radio coordination, vertical maneuvering, and ambush tactics. His motto, height, speed, maneuver, fire, turned the Airacobra into a weapon far deadlier than its designers ever imagined. Pokryshkin scored the majority of his 59 victories in a P-39, silencing critics across the globe and proving the aircraft was a monster in the right hands. As the war progressed, German units repeatedly encountered Soviet P-39 squadrons, particularly during operations around Kuban, Kursk, and later in eastern Prussia. Records show that hundreds of German aircraft were shot down by Airacobras, often in lightning-fast engagements just a few hundred feet above the battlefield. Luftwaffe pilots soon learned not to dive too low in P-39-controlled areas. When they did, they rarely came back. German propaganda, which once mocked the P-39 as a failure, eventually went silent about it. Reports from fighter groups described the Cobra-Staffeln, Cobra squadrons, as unexpectedly dangerous, especially in the hands of elite Soviet pilots. Luftwaffe pilots began requesting that engagements with P-39s be avoided at low altitude, a clear reversal of the dismissive attitude they'd held only a year earlier. The secret of the Airacobra's success wasn't speed or altitude. It was adaptability. It wasn't built to dominate every kind of air combat. It was built to excel in one specific environment. And once it found that environment, it became a legend. Its stability, heavy firepower, and rugged construction made it a perfect fit for the brutal, close-quarters air war on the Eastern Front, where there was no room for weakness and no escape into the clouds. By 1945, the P-39 had earned a new reputation, not as a failure, but as a highly specialized, highly effective low-altitude fighter. German pilots who once mocked it now respected and feared it. Western historians who initially wrote it off later admitted that on the Eastern Front, it was one of the most significant Lend-Lease fighters of the war. The Airacobra didn't just survive its critics, it outperformed their expectations completely. The story of the P-39 Airacobra is a reminder that a weapon is only as good as the tactics used to wield it. The Soviets didn't try to turn it into something it wasn't. They adapted their tactics to its strengths and, in doing so, transformed a misunderstood aircraft into a deadly frontline predator. German pilots weren't defeated by the machine alone. They were defeated by the pilots who mastered it. In the end, the P-39 Airacobra teaches one powerful lesson. Never underestimate a fighter designed for a specific environment. What German pilots dismissed as an inferior aircraft became one of the most lethal low-altitude fighters of the entire war. The Airacobra didn't win because it reached the highest altitude or the fastest speed. It won because it dominated where the war was actually being fought. And once it found its battlefield, no one was laughing anymore.